As we drove up from Florence to the north of Italy with my sister, my husband Guido said this really is one of the best parts of his country. We're eating al fresco on the beach last week, and now just 4.5 hours and we're in snow-covered Alps. Guido wanted to go skiing for the last snow of the season, and my sister was keen to join him. I had a lot of work to do, so I had to stay home, but I was excited about working from the mountains. I found a cabin nestled a little bit away from the town with a big kitchen and spectacular views of this part of the Dolomites. In our family, spiced hot cross buns with butter is such a tradition for Easter, but being Italian, Guido had never even heard of hot cross buns. Unfortunately, my sister had an accident the very first day we arrived and seriously injured her leg and had to be taken for an MRI and discussions with private doctors about surgery. She's okay now, but being a very active person who does yoga twice a day, cycles for 5 hours straight, and walks or rides to work every day, this was quite difficult news. So I decided to make this nostalgic recipe to celebrate being with my sister and cheer her up with the smell of homemade cinnamon, fruit and chocolate chip buns filling the cabin while soft snow fell around us. We don't eat a lot of bread, so I'm certainly not a pro bread baker, but this recipe is much easier than you think, even kneading by hand with no stand mixer. I use dry yeast. You always want to check to make sure it's not out of date and will activate, otherwise you'll go to all this trouble and not find out until the end that it's not rising. Many recipes will tell you to put it in warm liquid to see if it foams up, but remember, if the liquid is hot, you can kill your yeast. I take a little of the milk I'll be using and warm it up until I can put my finger in the milk comfortably without feeling like I need to withdraw it immediately. That's more or less the right temperature. You can also put a little bit of sugar in, which we'll be using later, and then just mix in the yeast and wait for it to slowly foam up until it's sort of like this. Now I put the rest of the milk on a low heat and melt the butter into it. One should use bread flour, but I couldn't find any in the little supermarket in this mountain town, so I'm just using normal flour. I would normally use vanilla bean paste or extract, but again, I could only find this vanilla essence. I use the zest of a whole orange, and I also grate some fresh ginger in as well. Shannon and Guido and I all love ginger, and I find the heat of ginger goes very well with spices. If you want, you can soak your sultanas in the juice of the orange we zested before. Helps them to plump up and take on a lovely flavour. Don't tip out the juice. I like to keep it for later when making the glaze. To the flour, I add cinnamon and nutmeg, quite a lot because I love a bun that is the colour of a latte, not just all plain and white. But you can obviously adjust the flavours of these buns to your preference. There's also some sugar and a little salt. You want to be careful with putting yeast directly onto salt because it will stop its magic happening. So I'm just mixing these dry ingredients, and then I add the foamy activated yeast, the melted butter and warm milk, an egg lightly beaten, and the dried fruit, sultanas and dried orange. I thought I'd add the chocolate chips later in case the heat of my hands while kneading melts the chocolate, but probably I could have just added it in at this point with everything else. My sister loves chocolate chips and Guido loves dried fruit, so I'm doing a little of both. Now, I sort of decided on my own the measurements and made this dough quite sticky because the more flour you use, the heavier and drier your buns become, and I want quite light buns. But have faith that this stickiness will be remedied by all the kneading we're about to do. You can flour your bench a little bit, but try to avoid adding more flour. Many bakers do a test to see if the dough stretches and is transparent without breaking. But I just knead for about 15 minutes until it's smooth. You do have to knead for a long time, but if you just put a podcast on, I find it goes by before you know it. Then I pour some olive oil into a big bowl with enough room for the dough to double in size. It's imperative that this is now airtight while the dough is rising. I try to avoid buying cling wrap, but in the apartment there was a shopping bag with a hole in it, so I just tied a knot in the hole and used that. You want to leave it somewhere warm, so I put my dough in the oven with the light on and left it for about 2 hours.
This is the true Italian that risks his life for soccer ball.
See, Mom, what? You don't even know which child it belongs to. Yours may double in size in just 30 minutes or an hour, but it depends on the humidity, the flour, your yeast. We were having dinner. I made homemade chicken stock for a risotto, so we had the time to wait. Then you punch it down and form an elongated log shape. If I were at home, I would have weighed each dough ball on the scale to make them all consistent, but this cabin didn't have any scales, so I just roughly approximated. At this point, I added the chocolate, and then there are fancy rolling techniques to round your buns, but I just cleaned the bench and it was late at night, so I simply pinched the sides around the chocolate chips and then turned them upside down, sort of cupping them a little, and the result was lovely and round. Then I covered them again and put them back in the oven with the light on for their second rise while we watched a film. I'm tying this with string and I cut the bag in half. It's the best I can do. At this point we wanted to go to bed, and I really liked the idea of baking the buns on the morning we were ready to eat them, so I kept them covered and put them in the fridge. The advantage of this is that the orange, the cinnamon, the nutmeg, it all has more time to blend and enrich the flavour. However, the next morning you just have to take them out and wait until they're back to room temperature. You can see they've grown quite a bit since I shaped the buns. We woke up to snow all around us, even cosier conditions for hot cross bun eating. I like to put a little egg and milk wash over the buns. Again, I'm without my pastry brush from home, so I just used my fingers. And I don't have my piping bag, so when mixing flour and water to make the crosses, I just dribbled the mixture on with a spoon, and I found this worked fine. It tends to be easier if you start at the center so it drops down. Of course, some people make crosses quite thick, but if you're not using a piping bag, I find it simpler to drizzle with a mixture that's a little more liquid. And now these go into the oven, which should be preheated to 180 degrees Celsius or 350 Fahrenheit for 20 minutes or until golden brown. Meanwhile, take that leftover orange juice from the orange we zested the day before and heat it with a little brown sugar to make a glaze. Most hot cross buns have shiny tops, but some people heat up apricot jam or orange marmalade. You want to put the glaze on while the buns are still hot out of the oven, so it falls well over their curves. You'll be heavily tempted to bite into one while it is hot, but bread is really best when you give it time to cool. And anyway, I actually prefer to cut open my hot cross buns and toast the inside before layering on creamy mountain butter and devouring it with a hot cup of tea. These were light and spiced, not overly sweet, so maybe I could have added more fruit and chocolate chips. The outer crust is crisp and sticky, and inside they are like fragrant, chewy clouds with that heavenly mix of orange, spices and chocolate. Nothing like a heavy, stodgy supermarket version, completely worth the effort. And actually, they really weren't that difficult to make at all. Thank you very much for watching. I'll put the recipe on my site, carlyflavel.com, and I'll see you next time. I'll see you next Friday. Alla prossima.